Hi everyone, this is Davis from Hardin County Conservation. Thank you for accessing our video through our website or our social media pages or our YouTube page. Today we are going to start our spring ephemeral or wildflower series, and we are going to cover some of the earliest blooming plants that we have here in the state of Iowa. You're going to get to see some of those here in just a little bit. We're going to talk about some individual species, some of the unique characteristics that each of those carry, and then we're going to get in depth with some of those plants as well. But the first thing I want to talk about is just kind of the generic things you should know about spring ephemerals or a spring wildflower. So we'll talk a little bit about their growth, why they grow when they do, what benefits they provide to our native ecosystems, and then some of the competition that they have with other plants that grow in our area too. So the first thing we are going to talk about is why these plants actually grow so early in the year. Some of the first wildflowers that we see actually grow in the middle of March all the way into the beginning of April. So they're very early bloomers. And the reason that some of these plants, for instance, snow trillium or skunk cabbage, the reason they bloom and grow so early is because they have adequate access to sunlight this time of year. So if you look behind me here and we look up at the trees have no leaves on them right now, and they won't for a number of weeks. And why this is good for our plants that are on the forest floor is they have perfect access to sunlight all the way throughout the forest. So if I'm a plant and I'm on the forest floor and I want to grow, the best time of year, even if it's cold outside, the best time of year for me to access sunlight for a number of hours during the day is going to be when there are no leaves on the trees. So that is the reason they grow so early. They don't really mind the cold so much. Some of the plants, like snow trillium, can even grow up through the snow. So weather does not bother them so much. It has more to do with photoperiod and the lack of leaves on the trees. So that's just kind of the generic intro for their growth. To talk a little bit more about spring ephemerals, we'll talk again here about the benefits they provide to our native wildlife and even our forest as a whole here. So spring ephemerals that are on the ground on the forest floor, when they actually die off later in the year, they will wilt and kind of fall down just like leaves do, and they actually add important biomass to the forest floor. Those plants are broken up by things like bacteria and fungi, and they're contributed back to the forest soil as a whole. So they're an important contribution to our soil mass here in the forest. Not only that, they provide tons of benefits to native wildlife. So pollinators specifically, we'll talk about Marsh Marigold and Spring Beauty in particular here in just a little bit in the video. Both of those plants have special adaptations where they use ultraviolet coloration on their petals to actually be able to attract certain types of pollinators. So they provide food to our pollinators. Not only that, the pollinators themselves actually transfer plants around the forest. So super important in that regard. They help those plants to move around and grow. Also, for a plant you're going to see here in just a little bit as well, something like wild leek that actually provides a food value to some of our native wildlife and even to people. Deer, rabbits, humans can actually eat wild leek. It's a great food source. They're a little bit strong. We'll talk about it after a while here. But great food source for our critters that are running around the forest here. So they have tons of benefits. They're super beneficial to our forest ecosystem as a whole, which is great. But one issue we run into with spring ephemerals, and it's not necessarily their fault, it's actually kind of a human-based fault. If you look behind me, there are some shrubby green plants, and those are a non-native invasive species that were brought over from Asia and Eastern Europe, and that particular plant species is what we call honeysuckle. And honeysuckle is pretty detrimental to our spring ephemerals and our forest ecosystem as a whole, because if you look at the vegetation right now, it's already greened up, unlike the trees. And this greenery, what it does, it actually shades out the plants that grow in the forest understory, so the stuff that's going to be close to the forest floor. These honeysuckles are actually going to shade those out so they cannot grow underneath them. So what we do to kind of counteract that, we will come into a large section of our property like this, because honeysuckle spreads like crazy. And what we will do is we'll take out kind of mass quantities of it at a time. We can basically clear cut it. We can dab it with herbicide treatments. We can burn it depending on the time of the year. So there's lots of stuff we can do to actually cut some of this growth back. But that opens up a lot of that sunlight early in the year for those spring ephemerals to grow. So it's a big benefit for us to come in and cut that stuff out, and it's very important that we do that in order to benefit our native pollinators and our plants too. So honeysuckle's very bad. You guys have probably seen it in about every forest you've been in Iowa. So we do like to remove that. It's definitely a good thing. So what we are going to do now that I've kind of given you a general intro, we're going to head down the trail towards the river, and we are going to talk about our first spring ephemeral. I will be doing some of the interpretation, as well as our interpretive manager out here at our nature center. His name is Chris Barber. He's kind of a plant specialist, so definitely listen in to him. But we are going to take you to our first stop, which is what we call Wildflower Hill. And the first flower we are going to talk about is the first plant that pops up every year here at Calkins Nature Area, and that is a plant called Hepatica. So stay tuned. All right, so we are on the north end of Calkins Nature Area right now. We're along the trail that kind of touches the river here. You can actually see the river over my shoulder. And one flower that we like to point out every time we do our wildflower walks is a special species that we get just in this kind of one area of our nature center, but we refer to it by a couple different names. Hepatica is one, liverleaf is another. We also call it liverwort. But I have Chris with me, and he's going to explain a little bit about the habitat preferences of this particular flower and kind of why it has its name. So I'll turn it over to him.
Okay, so Hepatica really likes kind of well-drained, calciferous soils where you have limestone outcroppings. And if you look at this hill behind me, it's pretty steep slope. We've got some, if you peel some of this moss back, we'd have some exposed limestone. And so as you can pan back, you can see there's a lot of Hepatica right now. Hepatica is one of our earliest spring bloomers that we'll see, next to maybe snow trillium and a few others. It's one of the earliest flowers that you'll see every spring. The reason that we call it liverleaf or liverwort, if we zoom in here, we'll see the leaves, and it'll have 3 lobes on the leaves, and that resembles the lobes of a human liver. And it actually, you can start to see this leaf here is starting to get a little bit older, and it is turning a dark purple. And so the older they get, as we go into the spring, they'll get a really deep purple. They are anywhere in color from almost bright white to a really bright purple. Some of these have a little bit more purple to them. And this plant is actually pretty high on the coefficient of conservatism, meaning that this plant will only grow in high quality woodland habitats. It does have one way to kind of tell it apart from our spring beauties, because the flowers do look awfully similar color. It has a real hairy stem, and then the leaf is much different on the Hepatica.
All right, so we've gone farther down the river trail here. We're now past our pine plantation, kind of down in an old oxbow next to the river here. And this depressed area gets a lot of moisture and a lot of water, so we do see a pretty good diversity of wildflowers here and spring ephemerals in general. But the one I'm going to talk about is actually the one that's right at my feet here, and it is what we call wild leek. Now, wild leek is an interesting plant. I'm going to let Claire come in and kind of zoom in on this guy. But this is wild leek, and they are actually in the same family as onions. So when you break this leaf off, it does smell like onions, and there are actually foragers that come out and they will eat these. But they refer to them as ramps. They have some other names too, but wild leek is the common term that we use. Now, when these are out in the wild, there are not a lot of critters that like to pick at them just because of that strong oniony smell and the strong onion-like taste. But as a last resort, kind of as we get later into the year and into the summertime, we do see deer and rabbits and things start to pick at these. You'll notice the top gets kind of picked off, but while these are early in their growth season here, they're very strong, very pungent, and things will not pick at them. So this is wild leek, and people can't eat these.
Okay, so here we've got another one of our spring ephemeral wildflowers, and this is kind of a unique plant because it likes really wet areas, and it's probably hard to see on camera, but maybe a little bit behind me. We're actually standing in the middle of an old oxbow. There's a creek behind me off to my left. That at one time the channel of that creek came right down through here and out and around. So the soil that's here is really rich. humusy. It still holds a lot of moisture. There's kind of a depression right here, and that is why we find this plant, which is the Marsh Marigold. This plant will actually live in anywhere from full sun out in a wetland to full shade here in the timber where we've got a closed canopy. It's a fairly early plant that emerges and blooms, and if you can come in here a little bit and point out a couple distinguishing factors on this plant. So we see these big kind of round shaped leaves. They're actually can be fairly easily confused with a wild ginger, which we'll see after a bit. But if you look at the stems, they are not hairy at all, where the wild ginger will be very hairy, that we'll see. Also, if you look at the flower, there'll be 5 petals, bright yellow, and if the camera can pick it up, there's kind of little tiny darker yellow rays in there, and if you put that under a UV light, you would actually see those rays kind of pop out and glow a little bit, and we'll see some other flowers that have the similar characteristics, and that's to attract pollinators. Some of the bees and flies and different flying pollinators will actually see those. They see in UV light, and they'll see those rays and guide them into where the nectar and also the pollen is. These also do not get heavily grazed by deer and rabbits and other herbaceous eating animals. They have a very highly acidic leaf, which makes a bad taste. So they have a natural defense against predation through grazers. They're fairly conservative species. Right here we just have a small little patch. This is one of the few patches that we have at Calkins Nature Area. Some of our other properties in Hardin County, you can actually see huge patches of these, close to half an acre or so, just solid Marsh Marigold. And they'll grow up a little bit taller. These guys will get 1 to 2 feet tall as the spring progresses. They are in the buttercup family, so there is a few other woodland buttercups that will have very similar looking flowers, but they don't get quite the cup shape that some of the other buttercups will have. And also you can tell a lot by where you find it growing. If you find a real wet area, that'll help kind of guide you towards the Marsh Marigold as opposed to some of the early buttercups that we see in the forest.
All right, so we've come up out of the oxbow now. We're still on our trail that kind of runs adjacent to the river here, but one plant that we always like to point out when we do our spring wildflower walks is a plant species called Virginia Waterleaf. We do have multiple species of waterleaf here, but Virginia Waterleaf is probably our most common. And it's a very distinct plant. I'm gonna let Claire come up here and we're gonna show you one. But the reason it gets its name waterleaf is if we look at the leaves of this plant right here, it almost looks like it has water droplets all over the leaves. And this plant does something kind of interesting that a lot of our plants do in the forest here, but they actually spread by what we call rhizomes, and I'm going to let Chris describe that process.
So rhizomes are kind of a unique plant feature that certain species of plants have. It's fairly common, especially in our prairies. We see a lot of rhizominous grasses like big blue stem and Indian grass. So what it does, instead of always spreading by seed, it'll send out an underground stem. It'll look much like a root, but it's actually, if you took a cross section of it, it is stem tissue. And so as it goes underground, it sends out a new stem. If this is your parent plant here, it'll send this underground stem up, or the rhizome, and then it gets to a point where it says I'm far enough from my parent, and then it'll pop up and grow over here. So as you were zoomed in close, I'm sure you could see in the background there was a lot of waterleaf. And generally when you find waterleaf, it's virtually impossible to find one plant. You'll find generally hundreds to thousands. And if you're looking at this, kind of green carpet that's behind me and throughout the forest in Iowa this time of year, most likely that green carpet or that blanket effect is caused by that Virginia waterleaf, and it's spread through rhizomes. And actually, being spread through rhizomes, all these waterleaves we see are classified as one plant, even though it looks like multiple plants spread all over. They all stem from one parent plant, and they can cover tens or hundreds of square feet all through one plant. So kind of interesting thing about rhizomatous plants.
All right, so we've come up the hill a little ways from the river in the little oxbow where we just showed you Marsh Marigold, Wild Leek, and some other plants. And we're going to talk about one that's a little bit different here. This is, the plant that's below me here is actually called Dutchmans Breeches. And I'll tell you why it gets its name in just a minute, but this is a really unique plant. It's got some unique characteristics. For those that have seen this plant in the wild, it's actually in the same family as squirrel corn, which is another kind of rare spring ephemeral that we have here in Iowa. And it's actually related to your bleeding hearts that you might have in your gardens or out in your landscaping. So all in the same family. They're species of poppy. They're in the poppy family. And these are actually incredibly poisonous, so this is a plant you would not want to eat. The leaves, the roots, basically every component of this plant is poisonous. Sometimes farmers will have cattle that come up and accidentally eat this if they're grazing through a timber ecosystem, and it'll actually cause the cattle to stagger. They might fall over. They can have frothing from the mouth. So it is quite poisonous. This is one that you do not want to eat if you're out foraging. But I'm going to show you the flower here and a little bit of the leaves. So this one has just kind of started to bloom. I can tell you that because I've now started to see that there's some pink coloration here, and these are pretty small, which tells me they're just starting to pop up. But if you look at all of the leaves here, very distinct leaves. They're very wispy, very unique compared to a lot of the other spring ephemerals that we have here in the forest. And here's a great example of a flower off of a Dutchman's Breeches. And let me pop this off for you. So the way that this plant actually gets its name is if you look at the flower and you flip it upside down, it looks just like a pair of pants or a pair of breeches. So this plant was named for its flower that it gets. And we are kind of at the beginning of flowering season for these. They tend to bloom a little bit later than some of the other plants we've shown you, like Hepatica, for instance. But these are still one of our earlier ones that we get here at Calkins Nature Area. So again, this is Dutchman's Breeches, and you can find this pretty much all over Hardin County. Any of our timbers are going to have this stuff, so definitely go out and take a look. They're very cool. But remember, don't eat it. It is super poisonous.
So here we have another one of our spring ephemeral wildflowers. This one's pretty common throughout Iowa. Pretty unique leaf, really easy to identify. It has really speckled, mottled leaves. They kind of have a rubbery sort of texture, if you can feel them. But this is the white trout lily. And if you look at the leaves, you can kind of see where it gets its name, because these speckles on the leaves look very similar to the speckles of a trout. It is, let me turn this guy over so the camera can see it. They always have this downturned flower. There we go. Real bright white petals with the yellow sepals and reproductive organs. So it just has two leaves that come out. It flowers for a very short period of time. In fact, here next to it we have one that's just about to open up. We're still pretty early to see widespread trout lilies in bloom, but once they hit their peak, there's areas you can go in the Iowa woodlands that'll just be blanketed with these guys. Another common name for them is the dogtooth violet, but they are actually a lily. They're not in the violet family, so we are in the lily family. But really neat, really kind of well-known Iowa spring ephemeral. Okay, so here we're below the wetland again, and we've got another really common Iowa woodland spring ephemeral flower. This one's really neat, really cool, easily recognizable. It's called bloodroot. We'll get to the naming of that in just a second, but if you can see, we've got really bright white flowers again. And what makes these guys so easy to identify over some of the other white flowers we've seen is when I open that leaf out, it has one single leaf with deeply lobed, divided leaf, really unique leaf shapes. There's really nothing else like it in our woodlands. Hard to get this confused. So what these guys do, put him back where he was nice and happy there. They'll flower for about a week or so in the spring, and then the flower will fall off, and that that big leaf, that kind of palm-shaped leaf, will continue to grow through about early to mid-summer. So about July, you'll really stop seeing them. But they can get, you know, they're silver dollar size now, but they can. We've seen bloodroot leaves that are the size of a good-sized pancake or so. So the reason that they get the name bloodroot is when you dig these up, the roots are actually contain hemoglobin, just like the same hemoglobin that's in our blood. That's what makes our blood red, and that's what makes these roots red. And the Native Americans would use that. They'd dig these roots up and use it for paints and dyes and things of that nature. So I'm going to go ahead, since we do have a fair amount right here, I'm going to carefully try to dig one of these guys up. And I'm going to show you this. Now, it's best not to be digging up a lot of the plants in the forest, but for educational purposes, we do it every once in a while. But there you can see that the main taproot broke off, and you can see how that's nice and bright and red. And if I don't know if the camera will pick that up, but if I dab a little of that, squeeze a little juice out there, and dab it on my skin, it's a nice reddish orange color. So I'm gonna go ahead. This guy's got enough root tissue left. I'm going to put him back in there, pack the soil back in, and he should be just fine and happy. He'll start regrowing that root like nothing ever happened.
All right, so that concludes our short discussion about spring ephemerals for this week. If you guys join us in the following weeks, we will actually discuss more wildflowers as they pop up in certain areas around our nature center. You'll get to see Virginia bluebells, showy orchis, some other really pretty plants that are unique to our area. So keep in touch with us. Be sure to continue following our social media and our website so that you can stay updated with some of those educational videos. But that is going to conclude our video for the day. If you have any questions for us, you can feel free to leave comments in the comment section below. You can send us a Facebook message on either our Calkins Nature Area page or our Hardin County Conservation page. You can message us on Twitter. However you need to get a hold of us, you can even call us at our Nature Center. The Nature Center's phone number is 641-648-9878. So reach out to us if you have any questions, or maybe you want to hike down our trails during this coronavirus stuff and see some of these flowers. We can kind of point you in the right direction. So thank you for joining us, and we hope you learned something awesome.